Today's theme explores one of the most persistent questions surrounding Vincent van Gogh's life. Did he truly meet the clinical criteria for schizophrenia? Modern diagnostic standards require a sustained pattern of symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking or behavior, and significant functional decline, while also ruling out other medical or psychological causes. By examining Van Gogh's documented experiences through this lens, we look beyond myth and speculation to understand what the historical evidence can and cannot tell us about his mental health. Today, a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia is based on the presence of specific symptom domains that persist over time and significantly interfere with daily functioning. Clinicians look for a combination of positive symptoms, disorganization, and negative symptoms, and they must also rule out other medical, neurological, or substance-related causes before confirming the diagnosis. Schizophrenia typically includes delusions, which are firmly held false beliefs that remain unchanged despite clear evidence to the contrary. Hallucinations, most often hearing voices, are another core feature, involving sensory experiences without an external source. Many individuals also show disorganized speech, where communication becomes fragmented, illogical, or difficult to follow, reflecting disruptions in thought processes. Disorganized or catatonic behavior may appear as unpredictable agitation, unusual movements, or a marked reduction in responsiveness. Alongside these, clinicians assess negative symptoms, such as diminished emotional expression, reduced speech, lack of motivation, and social withdrawal, which often contribute heavily to functional decline. For a diagnosis to be made, these symptoms must cause significant impairment in work, relationships, or self-care, and they must be present for a sustained period. The overall pattern, its duration, severity, and impact on functioning is essential in distinguishing schizophrenia from other conditions that can produce similar symptoms. Thor Sivert Fritland, welcome back to our ongoing series on the life and mind of Vincent van Gogh. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Today we're stepping into one of the most debated questions in Van Gogh scholarship. Did Vincent van Gogh really meet the criteria for schizophrenia? This is a topic where history, psychology, and myth often collide, so I'm grateful you're here to help us sort through it.
Thank you for having me back. It's a meaningful conversation, and I'm glad we're approaching it with care. When we talk about schizophrenia in a clinical sense, we're talking about a very specific constellation of symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms that must persist over time and significantly impair daily functioning. So, the question isn't just whether Van Gogh had moments of crisis, but whether his lived pattern matches what clinicians would recognize today.
Exactly. And that distinction between isolated episodes and a sustained clinical picture is where so much misunderstanding tends to arise. I'm looking forward to unpacking that with you. Thor, when we look at the modern clinical criteria for schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms, do we have evidence that Vincent van Gogh met these standards?
What we have are descriptions of crises, letters, and secondhand accounts, not structured clinical observations. Van Gogh certainly experienced episodes of confusion, agitation, and what some described as hallucinations. But these episodes were episodic, not continuous. A schizophrenia diagnosis requires a sustained pattern of symptoms that impair functioning over time, and that's harder to establish from the historical record.
So, when people say he heard voices or had delusions, does that align with the diagnostic picture?
Not in a straightforward way. Some accounts mention hallucination-like experiences during acute breakdowns, but they don't show a persistent pattern of auditory hallucinations, the kind that define schizophrenia. His letters remain coherent, reflective, and logically structured, which argues against chronic, disorganized speech or thought. And his periods of intense productivity, hundreds of paintings in a short span, don't match the functional decline we typically see in schizophrenia.
What about disorganized or catatonic behavior? There are stories of agitation, self-harm, and erratic actions.
Those episodes were real, but they were tied to acute crises, often following exhaustion, starvation, alcohol use, or interpersonal stress. Modern clinicians would consider alternative explanations: mood disorders with psychotic features, temporal lobe epilepsy, or even the effects of substances. Schizophrenia requires ruling out these other causes, and in Van Gogh's case, we simply can't.
And the negative symptoms, flat affect, withdrawal, lack of motivation?
That's the interesting part. Van Gogh had periods of isolation and emotional intensity, but not the classic negative symptoms. His emotional life was vivid, his motivation overwhelming, and his social withdrawal was inconsistent. He wrote passionately, worked obsessively, and maintained deep relationships, especially with Theo. That's not the profile of someone with long-term negative symptoms.
So, based on the core characteristics, would a modern clinician diagnose him with schizophrenia?
With the evidence we have, no. He had episodes that resembled psychosis, but not the sustained pattern required for a schizophrenia diagnosis. Most modern scholars lean toward a mood disorder, possibly bipolar disorder with psychotic features, combined with physical illness and environmental stressors. But the key point is that we cannot retroactively apply a diagnosis with certainty.
Thor, before we go deeper into the clinical picture, I want to touch on something that shapes almost every public conversation about Van Gogh, the mad genius myth. Popular culture has turned his suffering into a kind of shorthand for artistic brilliance. How do you see that influencing the way people interpret his mental health?
It has a huge influence. The idea of Van Gogh as the archetype of the tortured, unstable genius is so deeply embedded in films, novels, and even museum narratives that it becomes difficult to separate myth from evidence. Popular culture tends to compress his life into a single storyline, a brilliant but mentally broken man who painted masterpieces during chaos. It's compelling, but it's not accurate. When we look at his letters, his work habits, and the clinical criteria for schizophrenia, the picture is far more nuanced.
So the myth almost becomes a lens that distorts the historical record?
Exactly. Once the mad genius frame is in place, people start retrofitting symptoms to match it. A moment of crisis becomes a sign of chronic psychosis. A period of exhaustion becomes evidence of delusions. And because schizophrenia carries such strong cultural associations, it's often the first label people reach for, even though Van Gogh's documented symptoms don't align with the sustained pattern required for that diagnosis.
And films like Lust for Life or popular biographies tend to amplify the drama, right?
They do. They highlight the ear incident, the hospitalizations, the emotional intensity, but they rarely show the long stretches of stability, discipline, and clarity. Van Gogh wrote some of the most coherent, reflective letters in art history. He planned paintings meticulously. He worked systematically, sometimes producing a canvas a day. That level of organization doesn't fit the stereotype, so it gets edited out of the story.
So, in a way, the myth simplifies him, turns him into a symbol rather than a person.
Yes, and it also obscures the real complexity of his mental health. Instead of asking what happened, people ask, how does this fit the myth? When we return to the clinical criteria, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized behavior, negative symptoms, we see that the myth doesn't hold up. His crises were episodic, not continuous. His functioning between episodes was high, and his emotional life was intense, but not flattened or withdrawn in the way negative symptoms would suggest.
It sounds like the myth tells us more about our cultural fascination with suffering than about Van Gogh himself.
That's exactly it. The myth comforts us because it creates a narrative. Great art comes from great pain. But Van Gogh's life shows something different. Great art came from discipline, vision, and relentless work, even in the face of vulnerability. His suffering was real, but it wasn't the engine of his genius.
Thor, let's stay with the letters a bit longer, because they're such a powerful counterweight to the schizophrenia narrative. When you read them closely, what stands out to you as most incompatible with a chronic psychotic disorder?
The first thing is the continuity of thought. Across hundreds of letters, spanning years, Van Gogh maintains a stable, coherent voice. He reasons through ideas. He reflects on his emotions. He analyzes artistic problems with precision. In schizophrenia, we would expect to see disruptions in thought form, derailment, incoherence, tangentiality, but his writing shows none of that. Even during periods when he was struggling, the letters remained structured and purposeful.
And that consistency is important, right? Because schizophrenia isn't defined by isolated episodes, but by a sustained pattern.
Exactly. A diagnosis requires persistent symptoms that interfere with functioning over time. But Van Gogh's letters show long stretches of clarity and productivity. He writes about color theory, composition, Japanese prints, the economics of art, and the emotional lives of ordinary people. He's not drifting in and out of reality. He's deeply engaged with it. That level of cognitive organization is hard to reconcile with chronic psychosis.
What about insight? Many people with schizophrenia struggle to recognize their symptoms as symptoms.
That's another striking point. Van Gogh shows insight, and not just occasionally, but consistently. He recognizes when he's exhausted, when he's overworked, when he's slipping into a crisis. He writes about needing rest, about the importance of routine, about the impact of isolation. He even analyzes his own breakdowns with a kind of painful honesty. In schizophrenia, lack of insight, anosognosia, is common, but Van Gogh's letters show a man who is acutely aware of his vulnerabilities.
So, the letters reveal emotional depth rather than emotional flattening.
Absolutely. Negative symptoms, like emotional blunting, reduced motivation, or social withdrawal, are central to schizophrenia. But Van Gogh's letters are emotionally alive. He expresses joy, longing, frustration, hope, despair, full emotional range. He cares deeply about relationships, especially with Theo. He's driven, often intensely so. He plans series of paintings, studies techniques, and works obsessively. That's not the profile of someone with diminished emotional expression or motivation.
And the productivity itself is telling, isn't it?
Very much so. During his time in Arles and Saint Remy, he produced an extraordinary body of work, sometimes a painting a day, that requires planning, concentration, and sustained effort. Chronic disorganization, which is a core diagnostic domain in schizophrenia, would make that nearly impossible. His letters show him thinking ahead, coordinating materials, reflecting on previous works, and setting artistic goals. That level of executive functioning contradicts the idea of a persistent psychotic disorder.
It sounds like the letters don't just fail to support the schizophrenia narrative, they actively dismantle it.
They do. When you read them closely, you see a man who is vulnerable, yes, but also disciplined, reflective, and intellectually engaged. His crises were real, but they were episodic, not continuous. The letters reveal a mind that is organized, emotionally rich, and capable of extraordinary focus. That's why, when we apply modern diagnostic criteria, the schizophrenia label simply doesn't hold.
And perhaps the letters bring us closer to the real Van Gogh than any myth ever could.
They do. They show us a human being, complex, sensitive, hardworking, not a symbol of madness, but a person navigating suffering with honesty and astonishing creative force.
Thor, we've talked about how Van Gogh's letters undermine the idea of a sustained schizophrenic pattern. But there's another layer here. Some of his symptoms overlap with other conditions. Modern clinicians often must differentiate between disorders that can look similar on the surface. How does that complexity play into interpreting Van Gogh's case?
That's a crucial point. When someone shows episodes of confusion, agitation, or even brief psychotic symptoms, schizophrenia is only one possibility and often not the most likely. Clinicians today look at a whole spectrum of overlapping conditions. For Van Gogh, several alternatives fit the evidence better than chronic schizophrenia. His symptoms were episodic, reactive, and often tied to exhaustion, malnutrition, or alcohol use. That pattern immediately pushes us toward other diagnoses.
Let's take them one by one. What about bipolar disorder with psychotic features?
That's one of the strongest contenders. Bipolar disorder can include periods of intense energy, creativity, and productivity, followed by crashes into depression or agitation. During severe mood episodes, psychotic features can appear, but they're mood congruent and episodic. Van Gogh's bursts of extraordinary productivity, his emotional intensity, and the timing of his crises align more closely with that pattern. His letters show elevated mood, racing ideas, and periods of exhaustion afterward. But between episodes, he returns to clarity and high functioning. That's not how schizophrenia behaves.
And schizoaffective disorder? It sits somewhere between mood disorders and schizophrenia.
It does, and it's sometimes proposed on Van Gogh. But schizoaffective disorder requires persistent psychotic symptoms independent of mood episodes. In Van Gogh's case, the evidence for that simply isn't there. His crises were short-lived and tied to identifiable triggers: stress, isolation, overwork, alcohol, physical illness. There's no record of ongoing hallucinations or delusions outside those acute periods. His letters during stable times show no trace of psychosis. That makes schizoaffective disorder less convincing.
What about severe depression with psychosis?
That's another possibility. Van Gogh had periods of profound despair, especially in the months leading up to his death. Severe depression can produce psychotic symptoms, usually in the form of guilt, hopelessness, or self-blame. But again, these symptoms appear only during depressive episodes. Van Gogh's letters show deep sadness at times, but they also show hope, ambition, and connection. His psychotic-like episodes don't map neatly onto depressive phases. They're more tied to physical and environmental stressors.
And then there's substance-induced psychosis. Alcohol was a factor in his life.
Absolutely. Absinthe and other strong spirits were part of his daily environment in Arles. Chronic alcohol use, especially in combination with malnutrition and sleep deprivation, can trigger hallucinations, agitation, and confusion. Several of Van Gogh's crises occurred after periods of heavy drinking or extreme exhaustion. Clinicians today would consider alcohol-related psychosis or withdrawal as a real possibility. And unlike schizophrenia, substance-induced psychosis resolves when the substance is removed, exactly what we see in Van Gogh's hospital recoveries.
So, when we look at these overlapping conditions, schizophrenia becomes less likely?
Exactly. Schizophrenia requires a sustained pattern of symptoms across time, persistent delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, negative symptoms, and functional decline. But Van Gogh's symptoms were episodic, reactive, and surrounded by long periods of clarity, productivity, and emotional richness. When clinicians face overlapping symptoms, they look at duration, pattern, and context. And in Van Gogh's case, those factors point away from schizophrenia and toward a combination of mood instability, physical illness, and environmental stress.
It sounds like the more carefully we apply modern diagnostic standards, the more the narrative schizophrenia collapses.
It does. And that's important, because it allows us to see Van Gogh not as a symbol of madness, but as a human being navigating complex vulnerabilities, while creating some of the most disciplined, intentional, and emotionally resonant art ever made.
For earlier you outlined how Van Gogh's symptoms don't align with a sustained psychotic disorder. I'd like to move into something you've called the big pattern. When we place all his crises side by side, what emerges?
What emerges is a pattern that is emotionally coherent, relationally driven, and neurologically reactive, but not schizophrenic. When you map each crisis chronologically, you see that every single breakdown was triggered by relational pain, rejection, loss, abandonment, or the fear of losing someone he depended on. The rupture with Gauguin, the uncertainty about Theo's marriage, the loneliness in Arles, these weren't random psychotic episodes. They were emotional earthquakes in a man who felt deeply and reacted intensely.
So, the crises weren't spontaneous or unprovoked, which is something we often see in primary psychotic disorders.
Exactly. In schizophrenia, episodes often arise without a clear emotional trigger. But Van Gogh's crises were situational. They followed interpersonal stress with almost mathematical precision. And then comes the second part of the pattern. After each crisis, He returned to clarity, productivity, and technical mastery. He didn't linger in disorganization. He didn't show cognitive decline. He didn't lose the ability to plan, reflect, or create.
That's striking, because schizophrenia typically involves a gradual erosion of functioning over time.
Yes, and that erosion is completely absent in Van Gogh's trajectory. There is no cognitive fall, no progressive disintegration of thought, no flattening of emotional life. Instead, after each crisis, he stabilizes, often quickly, when he receives emotional safety. Theo's letters, the structure of the hospital in St. Remy, or even the presence of a supportive doctor were enough to bring him back to equilibrium. That responsiveness to relational stability is not characteristic of schizophrenia.
It sounds like the pattern points toward sensitivity rather than psychosis.
That's the heart of it. When you zoom out, you don't see the architecture of a primary psychotic disorder. You see the architecture of an extremely sensitive person with emotional and neurological vulnerability. Someone whose crises were reactive, not chronic. Someone whose mind remained intact between episodes. Someone who could think, plan, analyze, and create with extraordinary precision.
And that distinction matters because it changes how we understand both the man and the myth.
It does. It shifts the narrative from Van Gogh was schizophrenic to Van Gogh was sensitive, wounded, and overwhelmed at times, but fundamentally coherent. His art wasn't the product of psychosis. It was the product of perception, discipline, and emotional depth. The crises were storms, not the climate.
When you look at the big pattern this way, it becomes almost impossible to fit him into the schizophrenia framework.
Exactly. The pattern simply doesn't match. What it does match is a person with intense emotional reactivity, likely mood instability, and a nervous system that couldn't always withstand relational rupture. But the core of him, his thinking, his creativity, his insight, remained intact. And that's not schizophrenia. That's humanity under strain.
Or, let's turn to what many consider Van Gogh's first major psychological collapse, the period in The Hague with Scene. When we look at this episode through the big pattern, what do we see?
We see a pattern that is profoundly human and profoundly relational. The crisis around Scene wasn't a random psychological implosion. It was triggered by a cluster of emotional shocks that hit Vincent at the same time. He invested himself deeply, emotionally, morally, financially, in Scene and her children. He saw himself as their protector, almost their savior. When that relationship came under attack, it destabilized him at his core. And the social pressure around that relationship was enormous. Exactly. His family condemned it. The art community condemned it. Even Anton Mauve, his mentor, his father figure, turned away from him. For Vincent, that wasn't just criticism. It was rejection from the people he depended on for belonging. He interpreted it as moral failure, as being fundamentally unlovable. That's the emotional ground zero of his breakdown.
So, what did the breakdown look like?
It wasn't psychosis. It was deep depression, exhaustion, self-loathing, and confusion. He isolated himself. He stopped taking care of his body. He worked obsessively until he collapsed physically. His letters from this period show despair, but they remain coherent. There's no disorganized thinking, no hallucinations, no delusions. It's emotional collapse, not psychotic collapse.
And yet, even in that state, he didn't lose his cognitive structure.
Precisely. His writing is still logical. He reflects on his situation. He tries to understand what went wrong. That's not the profile of schizophrenia. It's the profile of someone overwhelmed by relational pain and shame.
How did he recover from this first major crisis?
Through environmental and relational stabilization. He left The Hague, moved to Drenthe, and later to Nuenen. He found structure in work, long days outdoors, drawing peasants, studying light. And crucially, he reconnected with Theo. That emotional lifeline restored his sense of worth. Within months, he was functioning again at a high level, producing disciplined, technically precise work.
So, the pattern is relational stress, emotional collapse, stabilization through work and safety.
Exactly. And that pattern repeats throughout his life. It's the signature of a highly sensitive person with emotional and neurological vulnerability, not someone with a primary psychotic disorder. In schizophrenia, you don't see this kind of rapid return to clarity and productivity after each crisis. You don't see this level of insight. You don't see this emotional coherence.
And this first breakdown already shows the architecture of all the later ones.
It does. The triggers are relational. The collapse is emotional. Recovery is grounded in routine, connection, and creative focus. When you understand this early crisis, you understand the blueprint of his entire psychological life.
Thor, let's move to the second major psychological rupture in Vincent's life, the Noonan crisis of 1884 to 1885. When we look at this period through the same relational emotional lens, what stands out to you?
What stands out is how tightly the entire collapse is tied to relationships, loss, and emotional shock. Nothing about this crisis resembles the onset of a primary psychotic disorder. Instead, it follows the same pattern we saw in The Hague: intense relational stress, emotional overload, collapse, and then recovery through movement, work, and new connections.
Let's break down the triggers. What were the emotional fault lines here?
There were several, and they hit him almost simultaneously. Conflict with his father, who was emotionally distant, moralizing, and often dismissive of Vincent's choices. Their relationship was fraught, and Vincent carried a lifelong wound around paternal rejection. The relationship with Margot Bagman, which ended in tragedy when she attempted suicide. Vincent felt responsible for her suffering, even though he wasn't. His father's sudden death, which struck him with a mix of guilt, shame, and unresolved conflict. He had argued with his father shortly before the death, and he internalized that as a moral failure. These weren't small stressors. They were existential blows to a man who was already emotionally raw.
And how did this emotional stir manifest in him?
Again, not as psychosis, but as depression, withdrawal, and emotional overload. He became socially isolated, avoiding people in the village. His letters show intense self-criticism, bordering on self-punishment. He experienced episodes of confusion, not disorganized thought, but emotionally overwhelmed. His physical health deteriorated from overwork and poor nutrition. There is no evidence of hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thinking. His letters remain coherent, reflective, and structured. This is emotional collapse, not psychotic collapse.
And yet, as with the earlier crisis, he didn't stay in that state.
Exactly. His recovery followed the same stabilizing pattern. He left Noonan, removing himself from the emotional battlefield. He moved to Antwerpen, then Paris, where he was revitalized by new artistic influences and new relationships. The environment changed, the relational pressure eased, and his functioning returned. His productivity surged. His technique sharpened. His artistic vision expanded dramatically. This rapid return to clarity and high-level functioning is not consistent with schizophrenia. It is consistent with a sensitive, emotionally reactive person who stabilizes when given safety, novelty, and connection.
So again, we see the same architecture as in the first crisis.
Yes, the pattern is unmistakable. Relational pain, emotional collapse, stabilization through work, movement, and supportive relationships. This is the psychological signature of a person with emotional and neurological vulnerability, not a person with a primary psychotic disorder. In schizophrenia, you would expect cognitive decline, persistent symptoms, and difficulty regaining functioning. Vincent shows none of that. He rebounds with clarity, discipline, and artistic precision.
And this pattern repeats repeatedly throughout his life.
It does. And the more clearly we see that pattern, the more the schizophrenia narrative dissolves.
Thor, we've now seen how Vincent's first two major collapses followed a clear relational emotional pattern. But the Arles crisis of 1888, His rupture with Gauguin and the infamous ear incident is the one most people point to when arguing he must have had schizophrenia. When we look closely, though, the pattern is just as clear. What do you see when you examine this episode?
I see the most relationally driven crisis of his entire life. Everything about the Arles breakdown is tied to his emotional investment in Gauguin. Vincent didn't just admire him, he idealized him. He dreamed of building a shared artistic community, a brotherhood of painters. Gauguin represented belonging, validation, and creative partnership. When Gauguin became cold, critical, and dominant, it wasn't just a disagreement. For Vincent, it was a profound emotional rejection.
So, the trigger wasn't random instability, it was the collapse of a relationship he had built his hopes around.
Exactly. And that's crucial. In schizophrenia, episodes often arise without a clear emotional cause. But here, the cause is painfully clear. Gauguin's distancing hit Vincent's deepest wound: the fear of being unlovable, unwanted, and fundamentally alone. The tension escalated for weeks. Vincent became increasingly anxious, sleep deprived, and overwhelmed. This is the emotional pressure cooker that led to the crisis, not a spontaneous psychotic break.
And when the crisis finally came, what did it actually look like?
It was a stress induced collapse, not a chronic psychotic disorder. He experienced panic, intense fear of abandonment, dissociation, a temporary break in emotional integration, confusion, but not disorganized thinking in the schizophrenic sense, and then the ear incident, which was an act of self directed desperation, not a symptom of hallucinations or delusions. There may have been a short lived psychotic like state, but it was acute, reactive, and resolved quickly. That's not how schizophrenia behaves. Schizophrenia requires persistent symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought, lasting far beyond a single crisis.
And again, his letters from this period don't show disorganized thinking.
Exactly. Even immediately after the crisis, his letters regain coherence. He reflects on what happened. He expresses remorse. He tries to understand Gauguin's perspective. That level of insight is incompatible with a primary psychotic disorder.
And then comes the part that really challenges the schizophrenia narrative: how quickly he stabilized.
Yes, the moment Theo arrived, Vincent calmed down. Emotional safety restored him. Within days, he was functioning again. Within weeks, he was painting with extraordinary clarity and structure. Think about that. After the most dramatic crisis of his life, he produced some of his most technically precise works: The Red Vineyard, The Bedroom, Sunflowers, The Night Cafe. That is not the trajectory of schizophrenia. That is the trajectory of a sensitive, overwhelmed person who stabilizes when he feels safe.
So, the pattern repeats: relational stress collapse, rapid stabilization.
Exactly. And the Arles crisis is the clearest example. The trigger was relational. The collapse was emotional and acute. The recovery was rapid once he received support. This is the psychological profile of a person with emotional hypersensitivity and neurological vulnerability, not a person with a chronic psychotic disorder.
And yet, this is the episode that popular culture uses to label him mad.
Yes, because it's dramatic, but drama is not diagnosis. When you look at the clinical criteria, persistent delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought, negative symptoms, none of that is present in a sustained way. What we see instead is a man under unbearable emotional strain, reacting intensely, and then regaining clarity when he feels safe.
So, even the most famous crisis doesn't support the schizophrenia narrative.
It dismantles it. The Arles episode shows us a man who breaks under relational pressure, not under psychotic disorganization. And that distinction changes everything about how we understand him.
Thor, we've now traced Vincent's crises through the Hague, Noonan, and Arles. Each time, the pattern has been relational stress, emotional collapse, and then a return to clarity once he regains stability. When we arrive at St. Remy in 1889, many people assume this is where the schizophrenia narrative becomes strongest. But when we look closely, the same pattern still holds. What do you see in the Saint Remy episodes?
What I see is a man who is overstimulated, exhausted, and emotionally vulnerable, not someone experiencing a chronic psychotic disorder. The triggers in Saint Remy are very clear. He was living in an asylum environment that was both calming and overstimulating at different times. He was isolated from the world he loved. He worked with an almost punishing intensity. And beneath all of that was a deep fear of losing Theo, who had just become a father and whose life was changing rapidly. These are emotional and environmental stressors, not signs of a primary psychotic illness.
So, the triggers were again situational, not spontaneous?
Exactly. The episodes were tied to overstimulation, especially when the asylum was noisy or chaotic, loneliness, which always destabilized him, intense work without rest, which pushed his nervous system past its limits, relational vulnerability, especially the fear that Theo's new family life meant losing the one person he depended on most. These are the same emotional fault lines we've seen throughout his life.
And when the episodes came, what did they actually look like?
They were short, reactive episodes, not sustained psychosis. He experienced brief periods of confusion, hallucination-like symptoms, but only during acute stress, anxiety and agitation, often after days of overwork or sleeplessness. But between these episodes, he was completely clear. His letters regained coherence immediately. His thinking is structured. His artistic planning is meticulous. And his productivity is astonishing. That is not the cognitive profile of schizophrenia.
So, even during his time in an asylum, he didn't show the persistent symptoms required for a schizophrenia diagnosis?
Not at all. Schizophrenia requires ongoing delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought, or negative symptoms. But Vincent's episodes were episodic, triggered, and short-lived. And between them, he was functioning at an extraordinarily high level, painting Starry Night, irises, wheat field with cypresses, and dozens of other works that show technical precision and emotional clarity.
And what helped him stabilize during this period?
The same things that always helped him: calm surroundings, quiet, predictable days, routine and structure, painting, walking, reading, letters from Theo and other artists, which gave him emotional grounding. When these elements were in place, he stabilized quickly. His functioning returned. His creativity surged. His letters became reflective and articulate again. This rapid return to clarity is not consistent with schizophrenia.
So, when we look at the St. Remy episodes in context, what do they point to?
They point to conditions that produce episodic dysregulation, not chronic psychosis. The pattern fits far better with epileptic episodes, especially temporal lobe involvement, bipolar spectrum instability with stress-induced collapses, trauma-related dysregulation, where emotional overload triggers short breakdowns. These conditions produce brief, intense episodes followed by full recovery. Schizophrenia does not.
So, even in the asylum, where the myth says he was mad, the clinical pattern still contradicts schizophrenia.
Completely. The Saint Remy period shows us a man who breaks under stress, but returns to clarity with rest and emotional safety. That is the psychological signature of sensitivity and vulnerability, not a primary psychotic disorder.
And this brings us closer to understanding the real Vincent, not the myth.
Exactly. The real Vincent was not chronically psychotic. He was emotionally intense, neurologically sensitive, and profoundly human.
Thor, we've followed Vincent through The Hague, Noonan, Arles, and St. Remy. Each crisis has shown the same relational emotional pattern rather than the sustained psychotic pattern required for schizophrenia. When we reach Avers in 1890, the final chapter, many assume this is where the illness caught up with him. But when we look closely, the Avers crisis is something very different. What do you see when you examine this last period?
What I see is not psychosis, but existential collapse. The triggers in Alvers are heartbreakingly clear. Theo, his anchor, his emotional lifeline, lost his job, became physically ill, and was suddenly struggling to support his new family. For Vincent, this wasn't just bad news. It was the shattering of the one relationship that had kept him afloat for years. He feared losing Theo's love, his support, and his presence. That fear was existential. It wasn't about symptoms, it was about meaning, belonging, and identity.
So, the emotional triggers were again relational, but this time with a deeper existential weight?
Exactly. The triggers were: Theo was losing his job, which threatened the financial and emotional foundation of their bond. Theo's declining health, which terrified Vincent. A crushing sense of being a burden, something he had feared his entire life. The fear of losing his only secure relationship, the one person who had never abandoned him. This wasn't a psychiatric trigger, it was a human one. It was the collapse of the one relationship that had held him together.
And how did this emotional earthquake manifest in him?
As deep depression, not psychosis. He experienced a profound sense of hopelessness, emotional exhaustion, a belief that he was hurting the person he loved most. But crucially, there are no signs of long-term psychotic confusion. His letters from this period are coherent, reflective, and painfully lucid. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't disorganized. He was heartbroken.
So, even at the very end, the schizophrenia criteria simply aren't there.
They aren't. There is no persistent psychosis, no cognitive decline, no negative symptoms. What we see is a man in despair, not a man losing touch with reality.
And this time, unlike the earlier crises, he didn't recover.
No. And that's the tragic part. In every previous crisis, he had a stabilizing force, Theo, routine, work, or a supportive environment. But in ours, the stabilizing force itself was collapsing. Theo was sick, overwhelmed, and frightened about the future. Vincent interpreted that as abandonment, even though it wasn't. Without emotional safety, without the reassurance he had always relied on, he couldn't regulate himself. This wasn't a psychotic break. It was an emotional implosion.
So, the final crisis wasn't the culmination of schizophrenia, it was the culmination of fear, love, and loss.
Exactly. It was the collapse of hope, not the collapse of reality. Vincent didn't lose his mind. He lost his sense of belonging. And for someone as sensitive and relationally vulnerable as he was, that loss was unbearable.
When we place ours alongside the earlier crises, the pattern becomes unmistakable.
It does. Throughout his entire life, architecture is the same: relational pain, emotional collapse, return to clarity when safety is restored. Except in Alvers, the safety never returned. That's why he didn't recover, not because of psychosis, but because the emotional foundation of his life had cracked.
And this final chapter reinforces what the whole story has shown. Vincent van Gogh did not fit the clinical pattern of schizophrenia.
No, he fits the pattern of a profoundly sensitive human being navigating unbearable emotional strain. His suffering was real, but it was not the suffering of a chronic psychotic disorder. It was the suffering of a heart that felt too deeply and a life that offered too little stability.
Thor, now that we've walked through each of Vincent's major crises, from The Hague to Alvers, I want to step back and look at the whole picture. When you place all these episodes side by side, a very clear pattern emerges. You've called it the big pattern. What does that pattern show us?
When you line up the crises chronologically, the consistency is almost startling. Every single collapse in Vincent's life was triggered by relational pain, rejection, loss, abandonment, or the fear of losing someone he depended on. There is no crisis that appears out of nowhere. There is no episode that begins without an emotional earthquake. That alone already separates him from the diagnostic profile of schizophrenia, where episodes often arise independently of interpersonal triggers.
And after each collapse, he didn't stay in a disorganized state. He came back.
Exactly. After every crisis, he returned to clarity, productivity, and technical precision. Look at the work he produced after The Hague, after Nuenen, after Arles, after St. Remy. These aren't the paintings of someone experiencing cognitive decline. They're the paintings of someone whose mind remains intact, whose perceptual world is coherent, and whose artistic discipline is extraordinary. Schizophrenia typically involves gradual erosion of functioning. Vincent shows the opposite: recovery, renewal, and often artistic breakthroughs.
And none of the crises show the cognitive deterioration that clinicians look for in schizophrenia.
Not a trace of it. His letters remain structured and reflective. His planning remains meticulous. His emotional life remains rich. His sense of color, composition, and symbolism becomes more refined, not less. There is no flattening of affect, no long-term disorganization, no persistent hallucinations or delusions. What we see instead is emotional overload, not psychotic disintegration.
And the speed of his stabilization is also telling.
It's one of the most important clues. He stabilized quickly whenever he received emotional safety. When Theo arrived, when a doctor reassured him, when he found routine, when he felt understood, his mind settled. His functioning returned. His creativity surged. That responsiveness to relational safety is not characteristic of schizophrenia. It is characteristic of a highly sensitive person with emotional and neurological vulnerability.
So, when we look at the big pattern, what does it point to?
It points to a man who was emotionally intense, relationally fragile, and neurologically sensitive, but not chronically psychotic. His crises were stress-induced, not psychosis-driven. His recoveries were rapid, not partial. His cognition remained intact, not deteriorating. This is the psychological signature of someone living with mood instability, trauma-related dysregulation, or even neurological conditions like temporal lobe epilepsy, not schizophrenia.
And seeing the whole pattern laid out like this really changes the narrative.
It does. It replaces the myth of the mad schizophrenic genius with something far more human and far more accurate. A man who felt deeply, who broke under relational strain, and who regained clarity when he felt safe. A man whose suffering was real, but whose mind remained coherent. A man whose art came not from psychosis, but from perception, discipline, and emotional truth.
And perhaps understanding this pattern allows us to see Vincent with more compassion and more accuracy than the myths ever allowed.
Absolutely. When we see the pattern clearly, we see the person clearly. And the person was never schizophrenic. He was sensitive, wounded, brilliant, and profoundly human.
Thor, now that we've traced each crisis in Vincent's life, I want to bring all of it together into a more accurate psychological picture. When we step away from the old labels and the myth of the mad schizophrenic genius, what does the modern, evidence-based understanding of Van Gogh's mental health look like?
When you synthesize everything, his behavior, the timing of his crises, the triggers, the recoveries, you end up with a picture that is far more coherent and compassionate than the schizophrenia narrative ever allowed. The most consistent modern understanding is that Vincent lived at the intersection of biological vulnerability, extreme emotional sensitivity, repeated relational wounds, chronic stress and isolation, and possible neurological factors. It's the combination of these elements that shaped his psychological life.
Let's first start with biological vulnerability. What does that mean in Vincent's case?
It means he likely had a nervous system that was naturally reactive, more easily overstimulated, more easily exhausted, more easily pushed into dysregulation. His family history shows mood instability. His own body reacted intensely to stress, lack of sleep, alcohol, and overwork. This doesn't point to schizophrenia. It points to a sensitive neurological baseline.
And second, emotional sensitivity seems to be at the core of everything.
Absolutely. Vincent felt everything deeply: joy, sorrow, rejection, hope. His emotional system didn't have a dimmer switch. When he loved it intensely. When he feared abandonment, it consumed him. This sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was the same sensitivity that made his art so alive. But it also made him vulnerable to emotional overload.
And third, those wounds were everywhere in his life.
Yes. From childhood onward, he experienced rejection, misunderstanding, and emotional distance. His father was cold and moralizing. His romantic relationship collapsed painfully. His friendships were fragile, and he depended almost entirely on Theo for emotional safety. Every major crisis in his life was triggered by relational pain, never by spontaneous psychosis.
And fourth, the lifestyle he lived didn't help.
Not at all. He worked obsessively, slept poorly, ate irregularly, and lived in isolation for long stretches. Chronic stress erodes emotional regulation. For someone with his sensitivity, it was like living with no psychological buffer. Under those conditions, even minor stressors can trigger major collapses.
And fifth, then there's the neurological angle, things like epilepsy.
Yes, several doctors at the time suspected temporal lobe epilepsy, and modern scholars still consider it plausible. Temporal lobe involvement can produce brief hallucination-like episodes, dissociation, and emotional storms, exactly what we see in Vincent. But crucially, these episodes are short, triggered, and followed by full recovery. That pattern fits his life far better than schizophrenia.
So, when you put all these factors together, what kind of psychological profile emerges?
A profile that explains everything we see. Breakdowns after emotional conflict, not random psychotic episodes. Short psychotic-like states under extreme stress, not persistent hallucinations or delusions. Intense mood swings, especially tied to relationships and exhaustion. Dissociation, particularly during overwhelming emotional pain. Emotional overload, where his system simply couldn't process the intensity of what he felt. This is the psychological signature of a person with mood instability, trauma-related dysregulation, or neurological sensitivity, not schizophrenia.
So, the most accurate picture is not a man losing touch with reality, but a man overwhelmed by the intensity of his inner and outer world.
Exactly. Vincent wasn't chronically psychotic. He was biologically sensitive, emotionally intense, relationally wounded, and chronically overstressed. His crises were human responses to unbearable emotional conditions, and his recoveries, rapid, clear, and productive, show a mind that remained fundamentally intact.
And that understanding doesn't diminish his suffering, it humanizes it.
It does. It allows us to see him not as a mythic madman, but as a profoundly sensitive person navigating a life that offered too little stability and too much pain. And it lets us appreciate his art not as the product of illness, but as the product of perception, discipline, and emotional truth.
Or, after everything we've explored, the five major crises, the emotional triggers, the rapid recoveries, the letters, the work, this feels like the moment to bring it all together. When we strip away the myths and look at the evidence, who was Vincent van Gogh really, beneath the cultural image of the mad genius?
When you synthesize all the threads, a remarkably coherent psychological portrait emerges. It's not the portrait of a man with schizophrenia. It's the portrait of a man with biological sensitivity, emotional intensity, and a lifetime of relational wounds, who nevertheless maintained clarity, discipline, and astonishing creative precision. The myth says he was chaotic, disorganized, and lost in madness. But the evidence shows the opposite. A mind that stayed intact. Across his entire adult life, Vincent demonstrated extreme productivity, hundreds of paintings in a few years, often one a day. Coherent, reflective letters, arguably the most articulate correspondence of any artist of his era. Technical precision in painting, careful composition, deliberate color theory, structured brushwork, periods of full clarity, long stretches of stability, insight, and emotional awareness. Worsening only under relational stress, never spontaneous, never random, always tied to emotional rupture. These are not the hallmarks of schizophrenia. They are the hallmarks of a sensitive, wounded, highly self-aware human being navigating overwhelming emotional terrain. A more accurate psychological portrait. When you put all the evidence together, the most coherent understanding of Van Gogh's mental life is a combination of biological vulnerability, a reactive nervous system, possibly neurological sensitivity, extreme emotional sensitivity, feeling everything intensely without filters, repeated relational wounds, rejection, loss, and emotional distance from childhood onward, chronic stress and isolation, overwork, poverty, loneliness, and exhaustion. Possible neurological factors, including temporal lobe involvement or seizure-like episodes. This constellation produces a very specific psychological pattern, breakdowns after emotional conflict, not spontaneous psychosis. Short psychotic-like episodes under extreme stress, not persistent hallucinations or delusions. Intense mood swings, especially tied to relationships. Dissociation, when emotional pain became unbearable. Emotional overload, when his system simply couldn't contain the intensity of what he felt. This is the profile of someone living with mood instability, trauma-related dysregulation, or neurological sensitivity, not a primary psychotic disorder.
So, the real Vincent wasn't a man consumed by madness, but a man overwhelmed by the depth of his own feeling?
Exactly. The human truth beneath the myth. He wasn't losing touch with reality. He was losing touch with safety. His crises were not psychotic collapses. They were emotional implosions triggered by fear of abandonment, loneliness, and exhaustion. And every time he regained emotional security, his clarity returned. His discipline returned. His genius returned. The myth reduces him to madness. The evidence reveals him as sensitive, perceptive, disciplined, and deeply human.
And perhaps that truth is even more powerful than the myth.
I think it is. Because it shows that his art didn't come from illness. It came from vision, from discipline, from empathy, and from a mind that remained intact even when his heart was breaking.
Thor, as we move toward a fuller psychological portrait of Vincent, there's one dimension we haven't explored deeply enough yet: the role of relational trauma. When you look at the most painful relationships in his life, you see patterns that today we would recognize as emotionally invalidating, inconsistent, or self centered. How do these relational dynamics help us understand his collapses?
They help enormously. When you examine the people who mattered most to Vincent, his father, Anton Mauve, Gauguin, even the townspeople in Arles, you see a repeating pattern of emotional environments that were harsh, rejecting, or unstable. These aren't diagnoses, they're relational climates. And for someone as sensitive as Vincent, these climates were psychologically corrosive.
Let's walk through some of those relationships. What stands out?
Each of them carried a form of emotional invalidation. His father was rigid, moralizing, and emotionally distant. Vincent's sensitivity was treated as weakness or defiance. Anton Mauve, who began as a warm mentor, suddenly withdrew and became cold when Vincent didn't conform. His approval was conditional. Paul Gauguin was dominant, dismissive, and psychologically forceful. He admired Vincent's talent but belittled his emotional intensity. The townspeople in Arles judged him, rejected him, and eventually petitioned to have him removed. None of these people were villains, but the relational patterns were deeply wounding for someone with Vincent's emotional makeup.
And for someone with his sensitivity, these dynamics weren't just painful, they were destabilizing, and it shows how these dynamics shaped his collapse.
Exactly. For Vincent, relationships weren't background noise. They were the emotional scaffolding of his life. When that scaffolding cracked, he collapsed. These relational wounds contributed to emotional collapse, especially when he felt rejected or misunderstood. Intense self-blame, because he internalized every rupture as a personal failure. Episodes of confusion, not from psychosis, but from emotional overload and dissociation. Overwhelming stress, especially when he feared abandonment. Breakdowns after conflict, always tied to relational rupture, never random. This pattern is consistent with relational trauma, not schizophrenia.
So, relational trauma becomes a key to understanding the entire psychological architecture of his life.
It does. Relational trauma, especially when repeated, can create a nervous system that is hyperreactive to conflict, rejection, or emotional distance. It can produce intense mood swings, dissociation, short stress-induced psychotic-like episodes, emotional flooding, collapse under interpersonal strain. These are exactly the patterns we see in Vincent. What we don't see are the hallmarks of schizophrenia: persistent delusions, chronic hallucinations, disorganized thought, or cognitive decline.
So, when we look at the relationships that shaped him, we see a man who wasn't mad, but wounded.
Yes, Vincent wasn't losing touch with reality, he was losing touch with emotional safety. His crises weren't symptoms of a psychotic disorder, they were the reactions of a sensitive, relationally vulnerable person overwhelmed by pain. And when he felt safe, when Theo wrote, when a doctor reassured him, when he found his clarity, routine returned. His discipline returned. His genius returned.
And that makes his story not just tragic, but profoundly human.
It does. It shows us that his suffering wasn't madness, it was heartbreak, and understanding that allows us to see him with the compassion he deserves.
Thor, you've shown how Vincent's crises follow a relational emotional pattern rather than a psychotic one. I want to explore a question that often comes up today. Could some of Van Gogh's psychological stress have roots in what we might now describe as narcissistic or emotionally self-centered relational dynamics among friends, mentors, and communities? Not as diagnoses, but as patterns that deeply affect sensitive people.
That's a very important angle. When we look at Vincent's social world through modern relational psychology, we see that many of the people he depended on, emotionally, artistically, or socially, related to him in ways that today we might describe as invalidating, self-focused, or emotionally unpredictable. These patterns don't require anyone to be a narcissist. They simply describe relational climates that can be deeply wounding for someone with Vincent's sensitivity.
Let's walk through some of those relationships patterns that are shaped like Vincent. What stands out?
Several of the most painful relationships in his life had traits that today we might associate with emotionally self-centered or invalidating dynamics. His father, rigid, moralizing, emotionally distant. Vincent's sensitivity was treated as defiance or weakness. Anton Mauve, warm at first, then suddenly cold and rejected when Vincent didn't conform. Approval was conditional. Paul Gauguin, dominant, dismissive, psychologically forceful. He admired Vincent's talent but belittled his emotional intensity. The townspeople in Arles, judgmental, rejecting, and ultimately petitioning to have him removed. These are not clinical labels. They are relational patterns, and for someone like Vincent, they were destabilizing.
And when we look at his social world more broadly, what do researchers see?
Researchers reconstruct his social life through phases and circles because the sources are incomplete. But the picture is surprisingly rich. First, early adulthood, Netherlands, England, Belgium. He interacted with dozens of people, colleagues at Goupil and C, students and teachers, minors and families in the Borinage. Only a few appear in letters, but the social exposure was broad. Second, artistic circles in the Netherlands and Belgium. He engaged with artists, models, villagers, seen Hornick and her family, clergy and townspeople. Again, dozens of contacts with varying closeness. Third, Paris, 1886 to 1888. His largest social expansion. He met the avant-garde scene, Émile Bernard, Paul Signac, Toulouse-Lautrec, Camille and Lucien Pissarro. Gauguin, cafe owners, models, collectors, dealers. This period alone brought him into contact with 50 to 100 people, many documented in letters. Fourth, Arles, Saint Remy, Auvers, 1888 to 1890. He interacted with the Roland family, Dr. Ray, Dr. Perrin, Dr. Gachet, asylum patients and staff, farmers, innkeepers, models. Again, dozens of individuals. What this means: he met hundreds of people across his life. Around 30 to 50 were meaningful relationships. His letters capture only part of his social world. His social life moved in waves, periods of intense contact and periods of isolation. This is crucial. He was not chronically isolated. He was relationally exposed and relatively vulnerable.
So, how did these emotionally invalidating or self centered dynamics impact him psychologically?
For someone with Vincent's sensitivity, these dynamics could easily produce emotional collapse when a relationship turned cold, intense self blame because he internalized every rupture, episodes of confusion, not from psychosis, but from emotional overload, overwhelming stress, especially when he felt rejected, breakdowns after conflict, always tied to relational rupture. This is the psychological signature of relational trauma, not schizophrenia. Relational trauma doesn't require violence or cruelty. It can arise from inconsistent, conditional approval, emotional distance, dominance, rejection, chronic misunderstanding, and these were the relational climates Vincent repeatedly encountered.
So, when we look at the big picture, what does this tell us about his psychological stress?
It tells us that Vincent's suffering was not the product of a chronic psychotic disorder. It was the product of a sensitive nervous system, a lifetime of relational invalidation, emotionally unpredictable friendships, chronic stress and loneliness, possible neurological vulnerability. His collapses were relationally triggered, not psychotically driven. His recoveries were rapid when he felt safe. His mind remained coherent, reflective, and disciplined. This is consistent with relational trauma, emotional dysregulation, or stress-induced episodes, not schizophrenia.
This reframes Vincent's entire story. Instead of a man destroyed by madness, we see a man overwhelmed by relational pain.
Exactly. And that makes his life not only more accurate, but more human.
We've explored Vincent's crises, his relational wounds, his emotional sensitivity, and the myth that distorted him. Before we close, I want to bring all of this into one final, honest synthesis. When we look at the evidence across his entire life, his letters, his behavior, his social world, the people who shaped him, what is the most coherent modern understanding of who Vincent van Gogh really was?
When you step back and look at the whole picture, the pattern is unmistakable. Vincent was not a man with a chronic psychotic disorder. He was a highly sensitive person, biologically, emotionally, and relationally, who repeatedly found himself in environments and relationships that were invalidating, rejecting, or psychologically overpowering. And those dynamics, especially when repeated, can create the exact symptoms we see in him: emotional collapse, dissociation, short stress-induced episodes, and overwhelming despair.
And these weren't isolated incidents. His entire social world was filled with emotionally difficult dynamics.
Exactly. When researchers map his social life across phases, they find he interacted with hundreds of people: colleagues, miners, artists, models, cafe owners, doctors, villagers. But the relationships that mattered most often carried traits we would now recognize as emotionally invalidating or self-centered. His father, rigid, moralizing, emotionally distant. Anton Mauve, warm at first, then suddenly cold and rejected. Paul Gauguin, dominant, dismissive, psychologically forceful. The townspeople in Arles, judgmental, rejecting, ultimately petitioning to remove him. These are not diagnoses. They are relational climates, and for someone with Vincent's sensitivity, they were deeply wounding.
And for someone wired like Vincent as a highly sensitive person, these dynamics weren't just painful, they were destabilizing.
They were. A highly sensitive person exposed to repeated relational invalidation can develop emotional collapse after conflict, intense self-blame, internalizing every rupture, episodes of confusion, not from psychosis, but from emotional overload, overwhelming stress, especially when fearing abandonment, breakdowns triggered by relational pain, never random. This is the psychological signature of relational trauma, not schizophrenia. And when you look at Vincent's crises, Every single one was triggered by relational rupture. Scene, Margot, his father, Gauguin, the townspeople, and finally Theo's decline.
And between crises, he showed the opposite of what schizophrenia predicts.
Exactly. Between crises, Vincent demonstrated extreme productivity, coherent, reflective letters, technical precision in painting, periods of full clarity, worsening only under relational stress. This is not the trajectory of schizophrenia. It is the trajectory of a sensitive, wounded, emotionally overloaded human being.
So, when we put all of this together, his sensitivity, his relational wounds, his neurological reactivity, what is the most likely diagnosis?
The most coherent modern understanding is that Vincent van Gogh was a highly sensitive person living under chronic relational trauma, compounded by mood instability, emotional dysregulation, possible temporal lobe involvement, chronic stress, and isolation. This constellation explains his collapses, his brief stress-induced episodes, his dissociation, his emotional overwhelm, his rapid return to clarity when he felt safe. This is not schizophrenia. This is a sensitive nervous system breaking under the weight of human pain.
So, who was Vincent, really?
He was not a madman. He was not a schizophrenic genius. He was a highly sensitive person, emotionally open, perceptive, and vulnerable, who repeatedly encountered relationships and environments that overwhelmed him. His suffering came from relational trauma, not chronic psychosis. His art came from clarity, not chaos. His breakdowns came from heartbreak, not hallucinations. And his legacy comes from discipline, vision, and emotional truth, not madness.
That's a very different ending than the one the world usually tells.
It is. And it's truer. It honors the man he was, not the myth we projected onto him. When we see him clearly, we see someone who felt deeply, loved fiercely, suffered honestly, and created beauty that still speaks to the most sensitive parts of us.
And maybe that's the real story. Not a man destroyed by madness, but a man overwhelmed by love, longing, and the human need to belong.
Exactly. And that makes him not a symbol of insanity, but a mirror of our own vulnerability and our own capacity for beauty.
Thor, this has been an extraordinary conversation. You've helped us see Vincent van Gogh not as the mythic, mad genius, but as a profoundly sensitive human being shaped by relational wounds, emotional depth, and environments that overwhelmed him. Thank you for bringing such clarity, nuance, and compassion to this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. It means a lot to speak about Vincent in a way that honors his humanity rather than reducing him to a diagnosis. When we look closely at his life, his letters, and the emotional patterns that shaped him, we see a man who wasn't broken, just deeply sensitive in a world that didn't know how to hold that sensitivity. If this conversation helps even one person see him with more empathy, then it's worth it.
Before we close, I want to give you the last word. When people ask, what was Vincent van Gogh's diagnosis? What should they understand?
They should understand that the most coherent, evidence-based conclusion is this. Vincent van Gogh was a highly sensitive person, biologically, emotionally, and relationally, who lived through repeated experiences of emotional invalidation, rejection, and self-centered relational dynamics. These patterns, especially when repeated across years, can create the exact symptoms we see in him: emotional collapse, dissociation, short stress-induced episodes, and overwhelming despair. His crises were relationally triggered, not psychotically driven. His mind remained intact. His art remained precise. His letters remained lucid. His suffering came from relational trauma, not schizophrenia.
Thor, thank you. Truly. Your insight reframes not only how we understand Vincent, but how we understand sensitivity, vulnerability, and the human need for emotional safety.
Thank you. And maybe that's the real legacy here. Not just the paintings, but the reminder that sensitivity is not a flaw. It's a form of perception. And when it's met with compassion instead of rejection, It can create extraordinary beauty.
And with that, we close our exploration of Vincent van Gogh, not as a symbol of madness, but as a mirror of human sensitivity. A man whose greatest suffering came not from psychosis, but from the pain of being deeply feeling in a world that often responded with coldness, dominance, or misunderstanding. And whose greatest gift was the ability to transform that sensitivity into art that still speaks to us today. Thor, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, may we all learn to treat the sensitivity among us with the gentleness they deserve.